NBC interrupts its regular program schedule to bring you the following special report.
Martin Luther King Jr. was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee, shot in the face as he stood alone on the balcony of his hotel room. He died in a hospital in Orlando.
The crowd assembled around the reflecting pool before the Lincoln Memorial occupies every inch on the lawns and under the trees. And there's a great swell of cheers to welcome Martin Luther King to the speaker's podium, a man who stands as a symbol of all they are fighting for.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined from New York by Black Lives Matter activists Zellie Imani. And in Reading in the UK, we have Mark Shanahan. He's a lecturer for politics and international relations at the University of Reading. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Zellie, if I can begin with you. As a foreigner who had a kid in the first grade in public school in the US, I remember the way she was taught civil rights history in the United States was essentially Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, and then a little bit later on, Rosa Parks sat on a bus, and a little bit after that, Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech, I Have a Dream, and a little bit after that, Barack Obama became the president of the United States, and everything was kind of much improved, right? I wonder, is the way Americans are taught their history and the way they commemorate and remember the likes of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. part of the problem?
I definitely think it is part of the problem because, as you mentioned, we're only given a small portion of the history of Black people in America, and we're only given a portion about how things actually were able to materialize in the civil rights movement. We don't know, the kids don't know about the struggle. They don't know about how protests were actually organized or how they were sustained. They really don't know too much about these icons and the heroes and what are the things they had to endure and what are the things that they actually championed for and actually things they actually fought for.
Mm-hmm. Mark Shanahan, was Martin Luther King Jr. one part of a collection of influences when we talk of civil rights, or was he that one moral symbol and the one man you could sort of use as a symbol to absorb all the other influences within?
He was one among many, but what made Dr. King different was his insistence on peaceful protest and also the fact that he was such a fine orator, that he didn't just appeal to one community, but that he got black and white working together, that he appealed to liberals and was actually able to convince some conservatives that the time for change was really there, and did it without raising a hand, without condemning others. So while he stands alongside the likes of Malcolm X and many others, he just has that little bit of head and shoulder room above the others that makes him so special and makes him remember him so clearly 50 years on.
Mm-hmm. So, Zellie, if he was born, I don't know, half a century later, and if he was around in this era, would he be mainstream or would he be marginal? How would authorities view him today?
I think that's a really interesting question because if you look back into the times of Martin Luther King, he really wasn't that popular, especially around the time of his death. His approval ratings were extremely low, especially after he came against the Vietnam War. So when we talk about the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King and how it's been extremely whitewashed, yes, now we are celebrating the legacy and the memory of Dr. King, but we have to always remember it wasn't always like that.
Mm-hmm. Would he be a supporter of Black Lives Matter?
I think he would definitely be a supporter of the Black Lives Matter movement because it's continuing the legacy of him as well as the civil rights movement. We're still fighting for the very demands that he was fighting for and so many other people were fighting for, to be free from racial violence and police violence and have access to resources that could create thriving, sustainable communities.
Yeah, so Mark, what does it say about the United States in the year 2018 that people are still saying, well, Dr. King's legacy not only lives on as something we can remember, but it's something we actually still have to implement today because we're facing some issues that are very similar to what he was fighting against. What does that say?
Absolutely. I think it's quite a damning indictment that you've got a white, middle-aged, middle-class professor standing here talking about it, that 50 years on, there still is that variation, and there is not equality in education, there is not equality in economic opportunity, there is not equality in housing. And you have a United States that is fragmented and is as divisive as it was back in 1968. I think Dr. King definitely would be a supporter of Black Lives Matter, but what he might have brought to the movement is that sense of coherence that would draw it all together and make it even more powerful for this age. So I wouldn't write him off. I wouldn't even say his reputation has been whitewashed over the years. I think he is still a very, very powerful figure, and possibly apart from Barack Obama, no one else has risen from the community in the same way.
Okay, so that's an interesting point. So Zellie, is what is needed right now that sense of coherence and that charismatic individual a la Dr. King in order to galvanize Black Lives Matter, for example? That's the point Mark's making.
I think with the Black Lives Matter movement that we didn't necessarily have a central leader. If you look at the 90s and early 2000s, the Black community always looked to people like Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson to stand up for people. But when the Ferguson protest erupted and the Baltimore protest erupted, it erupted without the assistance of any of the leaders. And what we've seen was the youth being frustrated about the conditions that they've been living in and that they've been waiting for this dream to materialize and that they had to take action into their own hands.
Yeah, so Zellie, I remember when I was in Ferguson, not only were they not embracing those leaders, they were actually telling them, go home, we don't want to see you. I mean, so I guess there were others like Dr. Cornel West who came on and said, you're the kids, we're going to let you drive it. You're the locals, we'll let you drive it. And they accepted and tolerated those types. But the others, the Al Sharptons and Jesse Jacksons, they said, go home, we don't want you. What does that say about lack of leadership, I guess? Or does that say that we're just waiting for the kind of maturation of some of these protesters and activists from within these communities to rise up?
I think that a lot of times people like to place leadership onto the Black community. And one of the other things that's very important that I think that we as a community have noticed is that once you have this one central charismatic figure, it's very easy for the government or any other person who wants to promote racial violence to pick off that particular person. We've seen that happen in the civil rights movement with the assassination of Dr. King, and we've seen that happen with the Black Power movement when so many of the Black Panthers were targeted and killed and jailed because of their responsibilities and because of their actions. So we're trying right now have more of a decentralized movement instead of a centralized movement.
Mark, historically, never mind the fact that the man was assassinated, we also had these revelations come out not too long ago that the FBI had blackmailed him, sent him letters, you know, related to affairs that he might have had, saying, we've got all this dirt on you, you might as well kill yourself, and so on. What lesson can we draw from that the authorities at that time would go to such lengths in order to try and neuter an extremely moderate voice?
Does it ever change? Authoritarianism existed then as it exists now, whether it is through Trump's America or in many other parts of the world. The fact that he was a peaceful protester who was charismatic and galvanised a movement around him is hugely unsettling to those in authority who maybe want to keep the status quo. So maybe Dr. King has a message for the United States, for many other regimes beyond the United States. That is uncomfortable for them to bear, but needs movements such as the one we've been talking about in this conversation to rise up more, to be more than just built around one person, and to have a real impact around change.
Zellie, for those who would look at America from the outside in and go, okay, so we see the incarceration statistics, we see the disparities in income, poverty, housing, police killings disproportionately targeting black people particularly, but at the same time, there aren't really laws on the books that are discriminatory. Would it be fair to make the conclusion then that it's a culture of racism that enables all this other stuff that's happening?
It's a mixture of things, because there are policies that, even if they don't explicitly say, you know, lock up or target black people, they're explicitly targeting black communities and black individuals, especially those that are in the most marginalized and victimized communities. So from the outside, even though it may not seem like it is a outright segregation, when you look at it from the outside or from the inside, you see that our communities are still segregated, and those communities that are segregated are still targeted through jailing, through police violence, and through other actions with poor educational systems. One of the things that I always talk about is that failing schools equals successful prisons. So all this plays a part, and all this plays a part into the systematic oppression of black people still in America.
Mark Shanahan, globally, in a nutshell, does Dr. King deserve to be among the greats in the pantheon of great leaders, such as, for example, Nelson Mandela, maybe?
He's there with Mandela, he's there with Gandhi. Somebody who, not on his own, but by building a movement around him that was positive, that was peaceful, and that opposed the oppressive hand of dictators, was able to galvanise change. I think we'll still be speaking about him in 50 more years or in 100 years' time.
Okay. Zellie, Imani and Mark Shanahan, it's been a pleasure talking to both of you. Thank you very much for joining us on The Newsmakers.